and orgonomy, which is a much broader range of scientific and potential practical applications, and then the yet broader issues of Reichian influence in the general therapeutic community and in the general population. Just this week, in a meeting with Kevin Hinchy from the Reich Museum, the Trust, and a documentarist who I'm collaborating with, we're beginning to develop a possible, full-length documentary, which has been in the works for a while. We were talking about really just one of the things I think that will hopefully emerge here, and is often lost, is just how pervasive Reich's influence has been. Not only, in one sense, what really gets clear is, even though he's marginalized now and very, very obscure in some ways, the 20th century, and certainly much of the 21st century, almost is not conceivable without Reich as a catalyst. Not necessarily, he didn't create it. I'm not being that out of touch with reality. But certainly the questions that he asked and the issues that he investigated and the areas in which he moved into investigation and active engagement with were all the central issues that we're still struggling with today. As I listened this morning to people noshing and talking about medications and vaccinations and child rearing and this and that, and my wife is a midwife, and the birth and et cetera, et cetera. All of these things, and politics, fascism, fundamentalism, are all the things that essentially Reich really put into, he wasn't alone, there were many around him, but he was the central catalytic and charismatic figure that really introduced this into the language and in many ways established much of the vocabulary that, while often is not vocabulary like holistic or bioenergetic or alternate approaches, these are terms that essentially Reich really put into play. Interpersonal therapy, the idea of training people in a very organized and careful and responsible way. These were all things that Reich, and then the responsibility of the therapist, whatever their practice, to being socially engaged and involved in social activism, was also something that Reich was instrumental in putting into play. So with that preamble, let me just start that it's really pretty much between 1929 and 1936 that Reich begins to break with the psychoanalytic movement. Historically, in the years between 1918 and 1930, Reich comes after the First World War. Reich arrives in Vienna, prepared to study law. Someone is eventually going to address why almost every one of the key figures in modern psychodynamic psychology often start out with the idea that they're going to become lawyers. Freud himself was originally going to be on the law faculty, and Reich is an example, and then numerous others. I think I saw someplace that Jung at one point was considering law.
Given later events, it's kind of unthinkable to imagine him being a lawyer.
Right, right. Well. Obviously, he found it unthinkable himself too. Within about, I think, by all accounts, within a few months or so, he decided that the law faculty at the University of Vienna was not where he wanted to be, and he himself says that the really exciting thing was the exciting game in town, where things were really happening, were the lectures and the seminars around the new psychoanalytic community. And he attended that pretty much as a student and moved into the faculty of medicine, which was essentially, most people should understand, was essentially within the School of Philosophy. One got your medical degree in the School of Philosophy. He quickly, at a very young age, got the attention of the inner circle, meaning the older guys who were in and around Freud. Freud was seldom present, but he got regular reports from his close associates. And Reich was tagged as someone who should be drawn in and encouraged. And I like to tell people, which is always fascinating, the way you got trained when Reich started his training, not just Reich, all training was quite simply that one of the older, more established therapists, sometimes Freud himself, if he had contact with you, would say, "You're a bright young man," or a bright young woman. Women were encouraged to. "Here's my card, and be at such and such place, or your apartment tomorrow between 12 and 1, and someone will arrive and present my card also to you, and that will be your first patient. Start doing therapy, start doing treatment." And you would, and Reich himself describes it. He would look and say, "Well, what do I do?" And the older analyst would say, "Listen, and when you run into a problem, come to me and talk about it." And that was training. Well, some years later, by the mid-1920s, Reich, along with others, were articulating. Reich took that very seriously, but he also took it as very, very clear mandate to read everything. Reich was, massively it's a polymath. I mean, he basically just consumed knowledge. So when he decided that he was going to be a psychoanalyst, he just consumed all of the material that he possibly could about this, and took this quite seriously and asked a lot of questions. But it became very obvious to him that there was no consistent way of learning how to be a psychoanalyst, and what was needed, quite clearly, and Reich always was very clear-sighted in this and practical, is my sense, the way I get it from reading the journals and letters and interviews with him, and interviews with people who knew him. He came up with the obvious solution, which is that there should be some seminar, some way of training individuals that is consistent, in terms of basic presentation of what one needs to know to be a psychoanalyst. That became, with the permission of Freud, the Viennese polyclinic or training seminar. Reich was disappointed initially, since he was the younger. He was not initially appointed as the director, but he was the associate director. But eventually became the director of the seminar. It was out of that program that what we know today as Reich's really premier work, which is character analysis, emerged. Okay. The other thing you can keep in mind as we go through the discussions today is that for those of us who are scholars of this, Reich tended to write books based on where he was at the moment. So the initial presentation of character analysis looks very, very little like the final edition, although it has obviously clear parallels, and some of the material actually remains from the original edition as it's incorporated into the final edition. What you read, what most of us read or use as character analysis, is really well, it's debatable. It's the third. We call it the third edition. It might well be the fourth edition, depending on some transitory moments between editions. But basically, it's the first development of character analysis emerged out of that seminar. One thing to keep in mind, again, in terms of Reich's interest here, was in locating the nature of the problems and how therapy doesn't work. Right? What's wrong? What goes wrong in doing therapy? Reich had a strict rule, which is seldom applied, except in my seminars when I do training. Dr.